The air hung heavy that Halloween night, thick with a chill that clung to the skin like damp cloth. A creeping fog rolled in, shrouding the streets in a ghostly veil. It was the kind of fog that swallowed everything: houses, trees, even sound, leaving only the crunch of footsteps on brittle leaves to mark the presence of life. Sophie pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, eyes flicking between her friends as they wandered farther from the safety of the neighborhood. The streetlights behind them had faded into a distant glow, and ahead of them loomed the old cemetery, black iron gates tangled with vines. No one in town ever talked about the cemetery, except in whispers, their words woven with unease, as though speaking of it might wake something ancient and restless. "This is stupid," muttered Caleb, the youngest of the group, trailing behind. His voice wavered, though he tried to mask it with bravado. "We should be hitting the houses on Elm Street. Everyone knows they give out full-size candy bars." Sophie glanced back at him, her breath visible in the cold night air. "Come on, don't be such a baby. We've heard the stories a million times, but no one's actually seen anything. It's just an old graveyard." But her words did little to ease the tightening knot in her stomach. She was the oldest, the leader, and couldn't let them see her nerves. Still, something about the way the fog curled between the gravestones made her uneasy, like it was alive, watching. Emma, always the thrill-seeker, had already reached the cemetery gates, her red devil costume standing out starkly against the gloom. She turned back to face the others with a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You guys really scared of a bunch of dead people? They're not going anywhere." "No, but we are," said Max, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. His eyes darted around as though expecting to see something shift in the shadows. "I heard my brother talk about kids going in there on Halloween, and they never came back out." "Yeah, well, I heard your brother's full of it," Emma quipped, pushing open the gate with a long, drawn-out creak that echoed like a scream in the still night. Sophie felt the weight of the silence that followed. The graveyard stood waiting, the fog pooling around the tombstones like a restless sea. For a moment, none of them moved. Then, with a nervous laugh, Sophie stepped forward. "All right, let's get this over with. We'll take a quick walk through, then head back to Elm. No ghosts, no skeletons, just a shortcut." The others followed, though Caleb hesitated, casting one last glance over his shoulder at the town behind them, as if hoping to find some excuse to turn back. But there was nothing, only the dense fog swallowing up the world beyond the cemetery gate. Inside, the atmosphere was different, colder. The fog seemed to have a life of its own, swirling low to the ground, clinging to the edges of graves that jutted from the earth like broken teeth. Their footsteps were muffled, swallowed by the damp earth, and every sound seemed amplified. The snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, even their breathing. "Are you sure this was a good idea?" Max asked, his voice hushed. "Feels like something's off." Emma smirked, but even she seemed less sure now. "Relax. It's just our minds playing tricks. It's Halloween, after all." As they passed through rows of gravestones, Sophie noticed something strange. The fog wasn't just moving with the breeze. It was twisting, curling in unnatural patterns, as though it had purpose. And then she saw it. There, just ahead, the silhouette of a figure standing unnaturally still between two weathered graves. A figure that hadn't been there a moment ago. Her heart raced. She stopped abruptly, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you guys see that?" The others froze, their eyes following her gaze. The figure didn't move, but it wasn't still either. The fog shifted around it, as if drawn to its presence, coiling like smoke. Emma stepped forward, her voice faltering. "It's just a trick of the light, right?" But deep down, they all knew there was no trick. The shadows had come alive, and Halloween had only just begun. The figure in the fog moved, slowly at first, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows. It glided forward, the mist parting in its wake like something unnatural. something far too old for this world. As it stepped fully into view, Sophie felt her breath catch in her throat. It was not a person. Not anymore. A skeleton stood before them, its bones gleaming a pale, sickly white in the moonlight. Loose, rotted cloth clung to its frame like the remnants of some long-forgotten burial shroud, fluttering eerily despite the still air. Its empty eye sockets seemed to gaze right through them, and its grin was wide and hollow, a grotesque parody of life. Sophie's legs trembled, but she couldn't move. None of them could. They were rooted to the ground, held captive by the skeletal figure's unnatural presence. It raised one bony hand. When it spoke, the voice was not a crackle of bones, but something far more chilling, low, rasping, like the wind whispering through 1,000 dry leaves. "Welcome, children of the night," it hissed, its jaw barely moving as the words slithered into the fog. "You've wandered far from the safety of your homes, and now you stand on sacred ground." Sophie felt the air turn colder, sharp as knives against her skin. Caleb whimpered softly behind her, and she could hear Max's nervous breathing quicken. Emma, however, took a step forward, her face pale but determined. "Oh, we're just passing through. No harm, no foul, right?" The skeleton tilted its head, the bones creaking with the movement. "Passing through?" it repeated, its tone laced with amusement. "On this night, none merely pass through. You've come at the perfect time, our time. And now, we offer you a choice." "A choice?" Sophie's voice cracked as she finally found the courage to speak. "What kind of choice?" The skeleton's grin widened, its teeth clicking together with a soft clatter. From the fog, more shapes began to emerge, other skeletons stepping out from behind gravestones, their empty eyes fixed on the children. There were 5 now, surrounding them in a loose circle, their bones gleaming in the moonlight like polished ivory. "A trick, or a treat," the first skeleton said, its voice dripping with malice. The others chuckled softly, a sound that echoed like the rattling of dry bones in the wind. "Choose wisely, for this night the choice carries great consequences." Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. She didn't know what the skeletons meant by consequences, but everything in her screamed that they were in danger. Real danger. This wasn't a Halloween prank. The fog was too thick, the bones too real, and the air too heavy with the feeling of something ancient watching. Emma crossed her arms, trying to regain her composure. "Okay, fine. It's a game. We pick, right?" She glanced at the others, her eyes daring them to argue. "I say treat." The skeletons exchanged looks, their hollow eyes gleaming. "The brave one chooses first," the lead skeleton rasped. "Very well. A treat it shall be." For a moment, nothing happened. The fog swirled lazily around their feet, and the skeletons stood motionless, their grins unchanged. Then, without warning, the ground beneath Emma shifted. It buckled and cracked, the earth groaning as something rose from below. Sophie stumbled backward, watching in horror as a small, ancient box pushed its way to the surface, dirt and roots still clinging to its sides. The skeleton knelt beside it, its bony fingers delicately brushing the top of the box. "Your treat, brave one," it said, and with a single sharp flick of its wrist, it opened the lid. Inside the box was a small, crimson apple. It looked ordinary, perfect even, its skin gleaming under the pale moonlight. There was something wrong about it. Sophie could feel it, the way her stomach twisted just looking at the thing. Emma hesitated, her bravado faltering. "That's it?" she asked, eyeing the apple warily. "Go on," the skeleton urged, its voice slithering with dark amusement. "A simple bite, a treat worthy of this night." Sophie's heart raced as Emma reached for the apple, her fingers trembling. Something in Sophie screamed at her to stop, but before she could say a word, Emma bit into the fruit. Silence fell over the cemetery. The sound of Emma chewing was the only thing that cut through the fog, her face twisted in confusion. Then she gasped. Her hand flew to her throat as she dropped the apple, stumbling backward. Her eyes widened with terror, her lips moving wordlessly. Sophie rushed forward, but before she could reach her, Emma crumpled to the ground. The skeletons laughed, the sound low and menacing, as Emma's body lay still, completely lifeless. Sophie's blood ran cold. "Who's next?" the skeleton whispered. The echo of Emma's body hitting the ground lingered in the air, filling the space with a horrible finality. Sophie stood frozen, her eyes locked on her friend, who moments ago had been full of life. Now, Emma lay still, her devil costume a stark contrast to the pale moonlight, the uneaten half of the apple lying next to her like a macabre offering. Caleb whimpered, backing away, his eyes wide with terror. "What happened to her? What did you do to her?" The lead skeleton, still grinning its awful grin, tilted its head. She made her choice. The treat was given, and she accepted it. Its voice was calm, almost mocking, as if the sight of a lifeless child at its feet was nothing more than an amusing trick. But as I said on this night, all choices carry consequences. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Her mind raced, replaying Emma's last moments over and over. Her confident step forward, the bite of the apple, the horrible silence as her body crumpled to the earth. This wasn't a game. This was real. And now, they were all trapped in it. Max, who had been standing in shocked silence, took a shaky step forward. His voice was barely above a whisper. Is she dead?" The skeleton chuckled softly, its bony fingers curling around the box that still rested on the ground beside Emma. "Dead? No, not quite. Not yet, anyway. You see, we are not so cruel as to take life without giving something in return." It gestured toward Emma with a sweeping motion. "She will wake eventually, but perhaps she won't be quite the same." Sophie's stomach turned. What do you mean?" The skeleton's grin widened. "There are many kinds of treats, child. Some sweet, some bitter. But the night is still young, and there are more choices to be made." Caleb's voice trembled. "I don't want to play anymore. I don't want to choose." The skeleton's hollow eyes shifted to him, and its voice dropped to a low, menacing whisper. "You will choose, boy, or the choice will be made for you." Max grabbed Sophie's arm, his grip tight and shaking. "We need to get out of here. Now." Sophie nodded, her mind spinning as she scanned the graveyard for an escape route. The fog was thicker now, swirling in dense, twisting patterns, making it impossible to see beyond the iron gates. The skeletons had surrounded them, and there was no clear path out. The only way was through them. "We need to play along," she whispered, her voice trembling. "If we don't..." Her words hung in the air, unfinished but understood. If they didn't play along, they would end up like Emma, worse even. Max swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Before Sophie could answer, the lead skeleton's voice rang out again, cutting through the fog. "And now, another must choose. Trick or treat." The group exchanged terrified glances. Sophie felt the weight of their stares, the silent expectation that she would decide. She was the leader. She had to be the one to face the next challenge, no matter how much her body screamed in protest. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Trick." The skeletons exchanged amused glances, their jaws clicking as they laughed softly. "Ah, the brave one chooses a trick," the leader rasped. "Very well. Let us see what fate has in store." The earth beneath Sophie's feet shifted, and a low rumble filled the air. Her heart raced as she stumbled back, nearly falling as the ground cracked open before her. From the depths of the earth, a skeletal hand reached up, followed by another and another. One by one, more skeletons pulled themselves from the grave, their bones rattling and clattering with every movement. Sophie backed away in horror as the newly risen skeletons began to approach, their empty eye sockets fixed on her. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as though savoring the moment. Her breath quickened, her legs trembling beneath her. "What are they going to do?" Max whispered, his voice barely audible. The lead skeleton didn't answer, but its grin widened. "The trick is a test," it said, its voice filled with dark amusement. "A test of fear, a test of will. Survive the trick, and you may yet leave this place with your lives." Sophie's pulse pounded in her ears as the skeletons drew closer, their bony hands outstretched. She felt Max beside her, his breath quickening in panic. Caleb had collapsed to his knees, sobbing. She knew they were moments away from losing control entirely. The skeletons were almost upon them now, their fingers inches away. Sophie clenched her fists, trying to steady herself, trying to think. There had to be a way out of this. Some trick to surviving the trick. "Don't run," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We stay together. We can make it through this." But even as she said the words, the doubt gnawed at her. How could they survive when the dead had risen, and the night itself was against them? The earth groaned beneath their feet, trembling as the newly risen skeletons closed in. Sophie's heartbeat thundered in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run. But she forced herself to stand still, to breathe, to think. Running wouldn't save them. If they scattered, they'd be picked off, one by one. She glanced at Max, who stood tense beside her, and Caleb, who was still on his knees, paralyzed by terror. They had to hold their ground, even if everything inside her wanted to bolt. The lead skeleton watched them, its hollow eyes gleaming with twisted amusement. "The trick is simple," it said, its voice cold as the fog swirling around them. "Endure, and you may leave. But if you falter, the grave will claim you, as it has claimed so many before." Sophie's breath hitched as the skeletons drew nearer, their bony hands reaching out, fingers scraping against the air. The fog thickened, curling around their ankles, pulling at them as though the ground itself was alive. Sophie could hear the faint sound of bones cracking underfoot, the cemetery coming to life in ways that felt wrong, unnatural. The first skeleton reached for Sophie, its fingers brushing her arm icy cold. She jerked back instinctively, but forced herself not to scream. Max, too, flinched as another skeleton came for him, its hollow grin locked onto his terrified face. Caleb whimpered, his eyes wide with terror, as a skeletal hand wrapped around his ankle, tugging him toward the ground. "No!" Sophie shouted, grabbing Caleb's arm and pulling him back. The skeleton's grip tightened, and Caleb's scream echoed through the cemetery as the earth beneath him cracked open, revealing the dark, yawning pit of a grave. The grave was waiting for him, hungry. "We won't make it if we don't fight back," Max yelled, his voice raw with panic. He stumbled away from the approaching skeletons, his hands raised defensively as though that could stop them. Sophie's mind raced. Fight back? How could they fight something already dead? Something without flesh or muscle? But she couldn't stand here and watch the graves consume them one by one. She looked down at the ground, her eyes scanning for anything. A rock, a stick, anything to use as a weapon. But the earth had already started to shift, the soil turning loose and unstable. "Caleb, stay with us!" Sophie shouted, yanking Caleb to his feet. He was sobbing, his face pale and streaked with tears, but he managed to stumble forward, away from the gaping grave. But the skeletons were relentless. More of them were rising now, their bony hands clawing their way out of the dirt. The fog seemed to pull them upward, bringing them to life with every passing second. Sophie's stomach twisted with dread. How many of these things were there? The cemetery wasn't just a resting place, it was an army. "We need to move," Max said, his voice shaking but urgent. "We need to get to higher ground, away from the graves." Sophie nodded, her eyes darting toward a small hill near the back of the cemetery. It wasn't far, but the path between them and the hill was littered with gravestones and more rising skeletons. Still, it was their best chance. "Head for the hill," Sophie ordered, grabbing Caleb's hand tightly. "Stay close and don't look back." Max didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted ahead, his feet slipping on the loose earth as the skeletons closed in from all sides. Sophie dragged Caleb behind her, her heart pounding as they weaved between the gravestones. The skeletons reached for them, their fingers just inches away, but they managed to stay ahead, for now. The hill loomed closer, but the ground beneath their feet was shifting, groaning. Another grave cracked open in front of Max, and he barely dodged it, stumbling over a root. The sound of crumbling earth filled the air as more graves opened, the dead eager to reclaim the living. Sophie's lungs burned as she ran, Caleb's grip tightening in hers. The fog was suffocating, thick and cold, pressing against her skin. She could hear the skeletons behind them, their bones rattling with every step. Finally, they reached the base of the hill. Sophie shoved Caleb forward, urging him to climb. Max was already halfway up, scrambling on all fours, his face slick with sweat and fear. Sophie followed, her fingers digging into the dirt as she pulled herself up. The skeletons were slower on the incline, their bony feet slipping on the loose soil, but they were still coming, relentless. They reached the top, gasping for breath, and Sophie spun around to face the horde below. The skeletons gathered at the base of the hill, staring up at them with their hollow, grinning faces. For a moment, they were still, watching, waiting. Then, the lead skeleton stepped forward, its voice cutting through the fog. "You've survived the trick," it rasped. "But this is only the beginning. The dead are patient, and they always collect what is owed." The words hung in the air like a curse, heavy and suffocating. Sophie felt a cold chill run down her spine. They had survived, for now. But the night wasn't over, and the skeletons weren't finished with them yet. The graves had opened, and the dead were waiting for their due. The wind whipped around them at the top of the hill, chilling Sophie to the bone. She wiped the sweat from her forehead, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Caleb sat next to her, clutching his knees to his chest, trembling with silent sobs. Max stood on the edge of the hill, staring down at the horde of skeletons below, their empty eye sockets fixed on the children like predators biding their time. "We can't stay up here forever," Max muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "They're just waiting." Sophie nodded, her mind racing. The skeletons weren't moving, but that didn't mean they'd given up. She knew better than to think they were safe. The graveyard itself seemed alive, shifting beneath their feet, hungry for something more than just their fear. "What do they want from us?" Caleb's voice was small, trembling as he looked up at Sophie with tear-filled eyes. "Why won't they let us go?" Sophie wished she had an answer, but all she could offer was a tight-lipped shake of her head. Whatever game the skeletons were playing, it wasn't over yet. They had survived the trick, but that didn't mean they were free. There had to be a way out, some way to escape this nightmare. But the fog surrounding the cemetery felt impenetrable, like a wall of darkness trapping them inside. Max knelt down, his voice steady but tense. "I think this whole thing is part of some ritual," he said. "The cemetery, the skeletons. It feels old, like something that's been happening for a long time. I don't think we're the first." Sophie's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" Max's eyes darkened as he glanced back at the skeletons below. "I've heard stories. My brother used to talk about the cemetery, how weird things happen here on Halloween. Kids disappearing, people hearing voices. I always thought it was just rumors, but now..." He didn't need to finish. Sophie could feel it too, that this wasn't just a random haunting. It was a ritual, something that had been repeated over and over through the years, claiming whoever was foolish enough to wander too close on Halloween night. But what was the purpose? Why were the skeletons rising now? What did they want from them? A deep voice echoed through the fog, cutting through her thoughts. "You trespass on hallowed ground!" The lead skeleton rasped from below, its words sharp as knives. The This place is not yours. The living are not welcome here. But you still breathe. So the game continues. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as the skeleton raised a bony hand, pointing directly at them. The other skeletons stirred, stepping forward, their movements slow but deliberate. The dead demand payment, the skeleton continued, its voice hollow. One of you must stay, must take the place of those who came before. Only then will the rest be free. Sophie's blood ran cold. They wanted a life, an offering. That was the cost. One of them had to stay behind, trapped in this cursed place forever. No way, Max said, backing away from the edge. That's insane. We're not leaving anyone behind. Sophie's mind spun. Could the skeleton be lying? Was this just another trick? But deep down, she knew the truth. The graveyard wasn't just a trap. It was a prison, a place where the living could be claimed by the dead. And now, it wanted one of them. We can't give them what they want, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. There has to be another way. Caleb shook his head violently, his face pale with terror. What if we don't have a choice? His voice cracked, the fear thick in his throat. They're not going to let us leave. Max's hands balled into fists. I don't care what they say. We're getting out of here. All of us. Sophie stood, her legs trembling. She couldn't let the panic take over. Not now. Not when they were so close to figuring this out. She had to think. If the skeletons were part of a ritual, then there had to be a way to break it. Something they could do to stop this nightmare. Her eyes scanned the fog, the gravestones, the hill. And then, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. At the far edge of the cemetery, beyond the thickest part of the fog, there was a mausoleum. Its stone walls were cracked and weathered with age, but it stood taller than anything else in the graveyard, its doors sealed shut with a rusted chain. I think that's it, Sophie whispered, pointing to the structure. The mausoleum must be connected to all of this. Max followed her gaze, squinting through the mist. You think that's where the ritual started? It has to be, Sophie said, her voice firm. Maybe there's something inside, something we can use to stop them. Caleb looked doubtful, but he stood shakily to his feet. But how do we get past them? He gestured to the skeletons below, who were still gathered at the base of the hill, watching with their hollow eyes. Sophie's jaw tightened. We'll have to be fast. Distract them, then make a run for it. Max nodded, his face set with determination. Whatever happens, we stick together. No one gets left behind. Sophie took a deep breath, trying to calm the fear twisting in her chest. We make it to that mausoleum, or none of us make it at all. With one last glance at the skeletons, they steeled themselves for the final push. The night was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. It was time to confront the secret of the graveyard and end the ritual, once and for all. The mausoleum loomed ahead, a dark, weathered monument to the forgotten dead. Its crumbling stone walls were veined with moss, and the rusted chains across the doors seemed to pulse with the weight of ages. Beyond it, the fog was thick as ever, churning like a living thing. Sophie's heart raced as they hurried down the hill, the cold air biting at her skin, every step bringing them closer to whatever waited inside. The skeletons hadn't moved, but their hollow eyes followed the children with unnerving precision. The eerie stillness was worse than their pursuit. It was as if they were waiting for the right moment, poised to strike when the time was just right. Sophie gritted her teeth, keeping her gaze fixed on the mausoleum. We just have to reach the doors, she whispered, her voice tight with fear. If we can get inside, we can figure out how to end this. Caleb was barely holding it together, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. I don't think they're going to let us leave, Sophie. They'll come for us. They're just waiting. Then we don't give them the chance, Max interrupted, his voice sharp. We're almost there. We need to keep moving. With renewed urgency, They dashed between gravestones, dodging skeletal hands that occasionally reached from the ground, grasping at their ankles. The air felt heavier now, as if something ancient and malevolent had awakened from deep within the earth. Sophie could sense it, a presence far older and darker than the skeletons themselves, watching from the shadows of the graveyard. As they neared the mausoleum, the fog seemed to thin, revealing the full extent of the structure's decay. Vines choked its stone pillars, and the heavy iron doors were streaked with rust. The rusted chains around the doors were thick, but not impenetrable. Max stepped forward, inspecting the lock with a grim determination. "It's old. I think I can break it," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small metal tool. Sophie didn't bother asking where he'd gotten it. Right now, she was just grateful Max was as resourceful as he was. "Hurry!" Sophie urged, casting a glance over her shoulder. The skeletons were still standing at the base of the hill, their motionless forms unnerving in the mist. But she knew it wouldn't last. The moment they tried to open the mausoleum, the dead would move. They would not let them go without a fight. Max worked quickly, his hands shaking as he tried to pry the lock free. Caleb hovered close by, wringing his hands, while Sophie kept watch. Every second felt like an eternity. The fog swirled, thick and unnatural, and the air seemed to hum with tension. Finally, with a sharp crack, the lock gave way, and the chains fell to the ground with a dull clatter. Max pushed open the heavy iron doors, and they creaked open, revealing a dark, gaping maw that led into the mausoleum's depths. "Get inside," Max hissed, waving them forward. Sophie and Caleb scrambled in first, with Max following close behind. The moment they were inside, they slammed the doors shut, plunging the mausoleum into darkness. For a moment, the silence was suffocating. The only sound was their own labored breathing, echoing off the cold stone walls. Then, slowly, Sophie's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she saw what they had walked into. The interior of the mausoleum was vast, far larger than it appeared from the outside. Rows of stone coffins lined the walls, their lids sealed shut, though some had cracked over time. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, and an oppressive feeling weighed down on them, as though the very walls were watching. Sophie shuddered, her gaze drawn to the far end of the room, where an ancient altar stood. On it was a large, ornate tome, bound in dark, cracked leather. Strange symbols were etched into the stone around it, pulsing faintly with an otherworldly glow. "That has to be it," Max whispered, his voice filled with dread. "That's where this started." Sophie stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel it now, the source of the cemetery's curse, the power that had been drawing them in all night. The book seemed to hum with dark energy, and as she reached the altar, she hesitated, her hand hovering above it. "What do we do?" Caleb asked, his voice small, almost pleading. Sophie swallowed hard. "We end this. Whatever ritual they started, we stop it." Before she could second-guess herself, she grabbed the book and opened it. The pages crackled with age, and strange, spidery writing filled every inch of the parchment. But there, near the back, she found what she was looking for, an incantation, surrounded by symbols she didn't recognize. The words were strange, foreign, but she could feel their power, thrumming beneath her fingertips. "We have to read this," she said, her voice trembling. "It's the only way." Max nodded, stepping closer to help, while Caleb hovered near the door, glancing nervously behind them. Sophie took a deep breath and began to read the words aloud, her voice shaky but growing stronger with each syllable. The air inside the mausoleum shifted, growing colder, as if the very walls were reacting to the ancient words. Outside, a sudden deafening roar shook the cemetery. The ground trembled, and Sophie could hear the sound of bones cracking and shifting. The skeletons were coming, and they weren't going to wait any longer. "Hurry!" Max urged, his eyes wide with fear. Sophie spoke the final word of the incantation, her voice rising over the din. The moment the last syllable left her lips, the mausoleum shuddered violently, and a wave of dark energy pulsed outward, rippling through the graveyard. The skeletons froze, their hollow eyes dimming, their bones crumbling as the curse lost its power. The fog began to lift, unraveling into the night sky, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the cemetery for so long finally dissipated. Sophie collapsed to her knees, exhausted but alive. The nightmare was over. They had survived. But as she stared at the crumbling remains of the skeletons outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, somewhere, was still watching.